Thank you very much. Welcome to this debate. The major questions then within our debate today are whether we should accept that the most important things in life are beyond language, or can we find the right words to say everything, even if we don't yet know them? And fortunately, we have a very lucid quorum of speakers to discuss this. Hilary Lawson is a postmodern philosopher and an outspoken critic of realism. On my far left, I have Genia Schonbaumsfeld, who is a professor of philosophy and a Wittgenstein expert. And here I have Stanley Fish, who is a literary critic and legal scholar, and he regularly contributes to the New York Times. So I'm going to pose this question, which I cited in the opening remarks, and I'll start first with Hilary Lawson. Can we find the right words for everything, even if we don't yet know what they are? Hilary, thank you.
Thank you, Joan. So we have the impression, don't we, that we can describe almost everything. We look around the room, we see people, we see objects, and so forth. Even to the extent that sometimes the world can seem a rather dull place where we have everything taped. But I'm going to argue that this is an illusion and that almost everything is left unsaid. Now, I don't say this because I'm somehow attached to a mystical notion of the world that I'd like there to be more. I say it in a rather nitty-gritty rationalist way, that if we set out to try and describe what the things are that we see and have contact with, we find ourselves unable to do so. I guess the idea that language describes reality and describes things out there in the world is a very sort of common sense view, and in the context of philosophy, it's usually described as philosophical realism, this view. Now, one first indication of the problem with philosophical realism is that all of those different things we see out there, we can take any one of them and we can describe them in some other way. So, this cup here, for example, what else might it be? Well, it could be a container. I might say, pass the water. I notice it actually says, I'm not a plastic cup, so presumably it's something else entirely. It could be...
It's my Magritte.
It's a bomb.
Yes, indeed. Well, it is. It's certainly an intellectual bomb, hopefully.
Yes.
It could be a lattice of molecules. It could be the residue from the Big Bang. It could be an environmental strategy. There's no limit to the number of ways we can hold this bit of the world. Usually realists try and get around this by saying, well, what's going on here is all of these different descriptions are of some underlying thing. But if you go and look for the underlying thing, if it's a physical thing, we can't find it. And in terms of the current scientific story, we'd end up with quarks and leptons and fluxes of energy, not really very credible as underlying things. And so, again, some realists have tried to propose that there's a transcendental thing that's somehow beyond all of these specific things, which accounts for all of these different ways that we can describe the world. Now, I want to propose that none of that is viable, and that instead we should think of the world as being open. And instead of thinking of it being made up somehow ultimately of bits out there, we think of it as being open, and we close that openness of the world with linguistic metaphors. I think we also do it with sensory metaphors as it happens, but anyway, we close the openness of the world. And those metaphors, or more specifically, more technically I describe as closures, enable us to intervene. And if we hold this as a cup, I can then elaborate that metaphor. I can say, well, what sort of cup is it? Where was it made? What was its design? All of those sorts of things. If instead I hold it as a lattice of biological molecules, I say, well, what is the shape of this lattice? What's the relationship between them? So each of our closures builds out as a sort of nest of more detailed versions. And those different metaphors enable us to intervene. If we hold this as a cup, we will then be able to intervene in it in a certain way. We'll be able to ask to pass it and so forth. If instead we hold it as something else, then we will change the way we intervene. So when we move from one closure to another, we change how we intervene in the world. My last thought to leave you with is that some of you may think, well, I'm rather attached to this idea that there's some underlying real behind all of these metaphors, and I don't really want to give it up. And to that I would say, well, for the past couple of millennia, we've not been able to identify the underlying things. There's no viable theory of how we could do so. There's no realist theory of language which would enable us to identify these things. And there's no realistic prospect that at some point we're going to be able to identify them in the future. So instead, if we hold the world as being open, there's an indefinite amount of potential to be able to hold the world differently, to generate new closures, new ways of holding the world that enable us to intervene and hopefully make the world a better place.
Thank you, Hilary. So I'll turn now to Genia Schonbaumsfeld with the same question. Can we find the right words for everything, even if we don't yet know what they are? Genia.
Okay, thank you. I think we need, first of all, to distinguish a number of different questions. So just already responding a tiny bit to what Hilary just said, I think we need to distinguish between the question, can there be one true description of the world, and the question, can everything be described? So those are two different questions. You might answer no to the first question. You might think there is no one true description of the world that has priority over other possible true descriptions. So that's one response you might make. But that's a very different answer to a different question when you're perhaps wondering, is there such a thing as the in principle inexpressible? So one way of understanding the question that Joanna has just asked is as the question, well, is there anything that transcends language? Are there certain things that we just cannot put into words? So I'm going to respond to that question. Is there anything inexpressible? Is it possible that we could find something that would resist any form of conceptualization, any rendering into a system of linguistic science? And my answer to that question is going to be no. So I'm with the later Wittgenstein on language, who thinks there is nothing beyond the bounds of sense except nonsense. So there's no such thing as the in principle inexpressible. And it's interesting that that would be the response of the later Wittgenstein, because the early Wittgenstein had quite a different view. I mean, some of you might be familiar with Wittgenstein's early work, The Tractatus. So in that work, he actually famously argued that all the things that really matter in human life, art, ethics, religion, all the big serious things, they are all ineffable. They're all in principle inexpressible. So he completely changed his mind in the later philosophy about that. And it's interesting to kind of just spend a moment thinking about why Wittgenstein had this view in the first place in the early work. I mean, you might think, it's a crazy view. Can it be right that really we can't say anything about art, ethics, and religion? I mean, what have all the great artists, composers, etc. done? If you can't talk about these things, then, what are we doing here? So, you've all come to the wrong place. We actually can't talk about these things. That would be really depressing if that were true. Now, the reason why Wittgenstein thought this in his early work is because he thought that language has an essence, so that there is one central thing that language tries to do, and in the early work, sort of to put it in a nutshell, he thought the essence of language is to describe the world, and crucially, to give you a description, a factual description of the way things are. And because he thought that the essence of language is basically to describe the facts, to provide linguistic models of the facts, for that reason he thought ethics, art and religion can't be put into words because, of course, these domains are not necessarily primarily fact-stating. I mean, ethics tells you about what you ought to do, not about what is the case.
For more debates, talks and interviews, subscribe today to the Institute of Art and Ideas at IAI TV.